Welcome everyone to the MVS Proseminar. Tonight's guest is Irenosen Okajay, which I'm really excited to hearing from this evening and be in conversation. Before we get into that, my name is Charles Stankovic. I'm the Associate Professor of Visual Studies here at the Daniels Faculty, and it's my pleasure to organize these talks. Tonight is a special guest, one I think we're inviting into a more visual arts community, but very excited about from a literary perspective. Hopefully we'll get into that intersection and crossover in the conversation tonight. Before I introduce our guest, I want to take care of a few housekeeping situations, including the two upcoming events. Our next event in the series is with Lorraine Fournier, and it's to celebrate the launch of her new book. So it's kind of another book launch like tonight. Her book is coming out on MIT Press. It's Auto Theory and Feminist Practice. She'll be in conversation with Pamela Mitarouz, so please tune into that on March 16th, and same start time, 5:30. The event is in partnership with MIT Press, the publisher, and also the local retailer, book retailer Type, who's been kind of an amazing institution in the city of Toronto, covering and carrying After All for us, one of our journals out of the faculty. So really great to partner with those two book people. The last MVS Proseminar speaker in the series is Rui Amaral. So really looking forward to him, a young emerging curator here in the city, who is going to be talking about his method of practice curatorially. And he's the adjunct curator of MoCA presently. So that will be March 23rd, so exactly a month. That'll wrap up our series for the year. So it's with that I want to introduce tonight's guest. And I'm really excited about this talk tonight, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the reading aloud. Irenosen Okojie is a Nigerian British writer. Her debut novel, Butterfly Fish, won a Betty Trask Award and was shortlisted for an Edinburgh International First Book Award. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, The Observer, The Guardian, the BBC, and the Huffington Post, amongst other publications. Her short stories have been published internationally, including Salt's Best British Short Stories in 2017 and 2020, Kwani, the world's best weird fiction. And she was presented at the London Short Story Festival by Booker Prize winning author Ben Okri as a dynamic talent, and featured in the Evening Standard magazine as one of London's exciting new authors. Her short story collection, Speak Gigantular, published by Jacaranda Books, was shortlisted for the Edgehill Short Story Prize, the Jhalak Prize, and the Saboteur Awards, and was also nominated for a Shirley Jackson Award. Her new collection of short stories, Nudibranch, which we'll be reading from tonight, was published by Little Brown's Dialogue Books and was longlisted for the Jhalak Prize again. So she's the winner of the 2020 AKO Caine Prize for fiction for her short story, Grace Jones, which is right smack in the middle of Nudibranch, and she was a fellow and vice chair of the Royal Society of Literature. So tonight's structure is a reading by Erenison for about 15 minutes, 10-15 minutes, and then we'll enter into conversation talking about the book and language and centering Blackness. And then we want to open that up to the audience for Q&A. So hopefully we'll get some engagement as we roll along after that conversation. We'll be using the Q&A interface. So if you could type in your questions into that, we'd love to get to them and just weave them into the conversation. You can do that by text, or of course, we always love hearing from people. So if you would like to join the conversation orally, please just raise your hand, and our amazing tech Renee Lear, who's behind the scenes as always making the magic happen, will make sure to unmute you, and so you can join in. So it's with that, I would love to pass this over to Erenison.
Hi, everyone. Charles, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm thrilled to be joining you guys tonight. I'm aware that this is a visual arts program, so it's wonderful to have this intersection of literature and visual art. And yeah, I'm really excited to kind of have this conversation. I'm going to be discussing and reading from my latest collection, which Charles mentioned, the Nudibranch. And it's a collection of weird and fantastical short stories, I guess exploring, looking at people on the cusp of some sort of change in their life and how they navigate that, and what the kind of coping mechanisms are in terms of living in the city, the loneliness of that, the strangeness of that, and just exploring, what it means to be human, but also I think particularly looking at women and people of color and Black women in particular, centering their stories, because often they're not, you know, they're not that visible in fiction. So Nudibranch does that, but within these really strange contexts, which is my kind of thing. So I was really excited to be able to like have this book come out. I'm going to read from Grace Jones, which is a story about a Grace Jones impersonator who's like navigating a past trauma and coming to terms with it in the present. So I'll read an excerpt from that for you just to kick things off. Once the stray parts of a singed scene had found their way into the bedroom, onyx edges gleaming, and the figures without memories had lost their molten heads to the coming morning, after she'd pressed her face against the space under the doorway, crying, reaching for some untouched handful of earth as sustenance, the agency called, Hassan more specifically. She'd narrowed down the things she planned to do that day to 3 options: stark, cold, and clinical, on a creased receipt for a disco light-hued Roland Murray jacket she'd worn only once. But the phone rang, shrill, invasive, demanding. Still on the floor, the wood cold against her skin, she crawled to the receiver tentatively, as if her limbs were tethered to a thread on the Earth's equator, the thread bending and collapsing into the different stages of her life. She contemplated the ways she could delay each inevitable outcome on the receipt. She could swallow it, wait for its disintegration in her stomach, acid eroding the words into nothing. Or she could simply misplace it in the flat somewhere, not outside, definitely not outside. It would be gone forever then. She'd have to go through options again, add in new ones, whittle it down. That process had left her brain frazzled overnight, her heart leaking through the bedroom keyhole, making a sucking sound as her hands turned to wax. The receipt would have to be misplaced indoors. That would give her the option of attempting to stretch the boundaries of time despite an internal wound the shape of a turret. In her mind, the draftsman was God. He had placed the turret inside her chest. Earlier, he'd drawn her in various angles, electric blue lines delivering degrees of shock from the same incidents. Each time she got up, each time she felt the weight of the turret tumbling in the ether. She picked up the receiver, cradled it firmly, careful not to let it slip from her grasp, the way things had of late. For a few seconds, there was silence at the other end. She knew it was Hassan. He usually waited several beats before speaking, as if allowing you time to adjust to a different frequency. He never introduced himself. He just expected you to know. And she always did. Sidra, so there's a party tonight. You don't have to attend. Might be fun though. The guy's a big Grace Jones fan. I've texted you the address. Do what you do. Any problems? Call me. Cool? Bet. She almost told him about the draftsman then. She found herself wanting to do it at the most unexpected times. Instead, she put the receiver down, hands trembling. She checked the table for the receipts. It had fallen onto the floor by the radiator, already misplacing itself. She'd forgotten to tell Hassan that she was considering taking an evening class 1 day a week. They were like that. So many things constantly left unsaid. She'd never asked him what a French Algerian man was doing running a lookalike agency in London, amongst other things. And he'd never asked what a girl from Martinique with a degree in forensics was doing, moonlighting as a Grace Jones impersonator. The translated versions of themselves staring at each other silently from the opposite sides of a revolving door. There was a building that remained a husk, a blackened charcoal carcass gutted from the inside out. The carcass leaned against the heavens in protest at its losses, at its snatched internal sky, tainted with the fingerprints of one last daily procession, rituals of the living. And while the world slept, awoke. The cities hummed with chaos and order. Rivers began in cotton pockets, cupping slackened fists. The waters undulated into lost reflections. The gods got high off the colors from the seas. The equator adjusted itself only slightly. The stars twinkled in haphazard collusion. The mountains dappled by a harmattan wind that became personal directions. The building remained, an artificial gut bathed in degrees of light, lodged in the stages of a day. The building was a hollow within a carcass, within a husk, within a world, within a galaxy. A series of crooked boxes varying in size, inside each other, where the gift was always the same, always attached to a bottom that had gone missing. On each floor of the husk, Sidra was running backwards to the late afternoon of a day. It had been flat packed into cardboard boxes sealed with sellotape. On each floor, Sidra peeled off the sellotape, the sound a split in the air whose line couldn't be traced. She removed items from the box. The late afternoon that day was made up of ingredients for cake: eggs, flour, butter, sugar, tinfoil, a whisk, vanilla. On each floor, Sidra ran to the window where she stood in costumes made of tinfoil. On floor 1, she was covered with eggs, screaming. On floor 2, she was drenched in flour, howling. On floor 3, she was soaked in butter, melting as a heat intensified while the whisk whirred ominously on the periphery, and so on. Grace Jones's La Vie en Rose played on a radio that wasn't plugged in anywhere. Instead, the plug sprang from the bottom of the building like an untethered electrical root. The husk shook. On each floor, Sidra grabbed the whisk. Lost scenes fell out from the windows. Water was inadequate. Hoses throbbed with adrenaline and burned hearts. Death traps. The lifts became stuck all over again, spewing firemen's costumes like overgrown fabricated insects. Like Genesis on speed, everything escalated quickly. Ashes assembled into figures crawling on the skyline before colliding with traffic, which destroyed them all over again. The equator turned a fraction. The flames rose. The bottoms of the crooked boxes were set alight. Debris became glowing cinders that walked. A dot appeared on the galaxy. The draftsman held a flame he angled like a stick of lead, like a tool that could change guise at any point. Sidra had first seen Grace on TV. She must have been around 13 at the time. She'd been chasing Carla and Dorianne, who were playing with a set of screwdrivers behind the sofa, darting forwards and backwards in a mock game of fencing, shouting, "On guard!" sporadically, brandishing the screwdrivers like long, elegantly carved swords. The washing machine was spinning. The windows were open to hide evidence of her botched attempt at gumbo. The smoke alarm was broken. Half an hour earlier, it had beeped incessantly. In her frustrated efforts to silence it, she'd broken it with a broom. But none of that mattered because a woman who looked like her was on TV. Called to the screen by an instinct she didn't quite understand, she stared. It was on BBC One. She'd never seen a Black woman so unapologetically dark on the screen. It was beautiful and she was hypnotized. Dressed in an all-Black catsuit, the woman was tall, striking, otherworldly, confident. Her mouth painted fire engine red. Her head was in an off-yellow helmet shaped like a bee's nest. Sidra half expected a swarm of bees to hover over the woman's head, the queen bee in action. She felt as if they'd shared the same womb, separated by a few decades and a trail of bees fat with mutual DNA and womb lining. Grace Jones, they said. Grace Jones. She repeated the words aloud, feeling them roll off her tongue while the washing machine spun while Carla and Dorian swapped the screwdrivers for Power Ranger toys, starting wars in patois. The screen jumped, flickered, the picture vanished. Grace had been brought to her on a signal from Jupiter. She grabbed the hanger on the floor behind the TV, stretched its curved head and inserted it into the television's aerial sockets. The picture returned. Grace was gone, replaced by an item on an infected brand of milk. Her heart sank, but the image of Grace was burned into her head as if with an iron. She ran to her mother's room, opened her makeup drawers, searching through the lipsticks, pouting her lips. She flung the wardrobe door open, its mirrors multiplying her automatically. She dived in. In the dark, she heard the flutter of a wing. A bee with a fire engine red mouth floated in a trail of static. I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Erenison. I should just say, it's an excerpt out of a wild story between a crazy party that goes all wrong, and obviously the fire that eventually comes. I won't spoil any more, but it's a great kind of expert to get us started in this conversation tonight. The first thing when I was reading your story and excited about you doing the reading tonight, it was really exciting because, I mean, there's a million things you could pull out of it. You're writing very, like, it's rhapsodic, it's very sensual, it's an explosion of color and senses. But like one thing that just kept, teasing me was the tongue. And so it was great to have you reading tonight, because literally, I think in every short story, by page 2 or 3 in the short story, the tongue has been mentioned. And whether it's the incantation at the beginning as part of something, you're literally licking reality, it seems like, or the psychedelic licorice that happens in the second, or the sexual, penetrations, and like it's just the tongue is there. And I was really wondering about if you could talk about that in regards to what you're doing with language. I mean, obviously there's something you're really chasing after and you're performing, and whether you're reading it or performing it with the tongue, whether the tongue is imaginatory or not, I think all of these things are blended. And so could you tell us kind of what you're trying to do with language, and if it's a coincidence that the tongue, it's even a character, right? It's a character in one of the main stories, this tongue in the pocket that seems
to absolutely. In the story about monks, Philano, which is, I think, probably the wildest story in the collection, probably the weirdest story in the collection. But yeah, I mean, in terms of language, I am really interested in stretching language and pushing the boundaries in terms of what you can do with it, especially like unique imagery, because I think that often when people come to the page and you read certain things, sometimes as a reader you can predict what's coming next, and that can be really comforting, and that can put you in, this writer knows what they're doing, I'm in a safe space. I kind of want to upend all of that in my very sort of cheeky way of wanting to disconcert the reader. So I'm always interested in unique imagery, but I think that has a connection to just being somebody who is fascinated by the everyday and the surreal and what comes out of that, that combination. And I'm seeing that, when, everybody has a unique way of looking at the world. For me, I always happen to see strange things. And I was saying the other day that it's impossible for me to write a straight story. Like, I've tried in the past, but I just can't do it. So I kind of have succumbed to the fact that I like to play with everything in terms of form and language. And I think poetry has a really strong influence, because when I first started really actively like practicing the craft of, novel writing and short story writing, I would read poetry first thing in the morning, 6 a.m. I would be reading. I was obsessed, and still am, with June Jordan's work. I just think she's a tremendous, not just poet, but thinker. And what she was doing with language and her poetry was it just blew my mind. It was so expansive and so varied, and you couldn't pigeonhole her. It was incredibly political. She was writing about Blackness. She was writing about her lived experiences, but she was doing it in these incredibly dynamic and interesting ways. So I found it fascinating that with that form, which is kind of restrictive in a way, that you could do so much still. So that kind of opened up my brain in terms of what you could do with language, and it made me really fearless. So it meant that through that practice, I never want to, certain sentences or scenes to be predictable. I kind of want to surprise the reader, but also surprise myself, because people often say, oh, the stories are really wild. Like, do you have that in mind when you're writing them? Often I'm surprised, because, sometimes I come to the page not knowing. And I think that keeps it exciting for me. It keeps it fun. One of my favorite directors, David Lynch, has a saying where he says, you gotta let the goldfish come to you in terms of ideas, and which means you have to leave space for fluidity. So I'm always looking to do that. And it's interesting about the tongue, because that's been mentioned to me before. Obviously in Falamo, that has a very particular dimension in the story. But I think I am just fascinated, like I am quite a sensual writer, and I am fascinated by, language and travel, and the sense that you can travel through languages and the tongue, and what it can do and what it means metaphorically, and taste, and all these things. It has so many functions. I think visually it just looks really odd. It looks like a creature in itself. This kind of pink entity that's very strange that we have as human beings. So if you just look at it on its own, it's a really odd thing. So I'm always kind of, I think, subconsciously playing around with that. And that has manifested in the stories, the different contexts that I can create around it, the sort of interesting imagery to play with it. But using Falamo, making it a character in that story, it was just, at first I thought, should I really do this? This is really crazy. Like, should I really make it a character? But for me, it kind of works, because when you get the full context of the piece and you see what happens at the end, not to spoil it, you kind of are invested in that world, so you go with it. I think often as a short story writer, you have to create, that suspension of disbelief, but also anchor it in certain things that feel real. So in that particular story, that I'd always been fascinated by monks and the kind of this hidden world. I feel very much that the way they live, the sacrifices they make, we don't really know that much about it, and it just always intrigued me. So to be able to create a context around it was really, really fun.
It's interesting you mentioned David Lynch, because in another way, the titular story, or Nudibranch, it's a mollusk, right? I mean, in a sense, it's not very tongue-like in itself, but it's like the psychedelic tongue, with its color form, but it's still this kind of organ that's very tongue-like. And I think it's David Lynch. It's like he makes the everyday extraordinary. He makes the ordinary extraordinary. It's kind of his line. And so he has this ability of body parts, particularly fragmented body parts, with the chopped ears and stuff. And the fragmented body is very important in your literature. That's kind of chasing after an explosion of senses, and a synesthesia almost, I would say. I wanted to also ask you about centering Blackness and really how you're pushing that. We've talked about that. You've been in interviews about that, and I was wondering and Grace Jones is really, I don't know how autobiographical that one is. I mean, I know that's always the question when talking to writers, but literally, to see the image of this powerful Black figure as a media icon and giving body and flesh and power and all these things. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, I mean, I've always been a voracious reader and consumer of art and literature since I was a kid. And one of the frustrating things was loving books so much, but not really seeing myself reflected in those books, and I had to very often turn to American literature to see myself, to feel seen, people like James Baldwin and Toni Morrison and J. California Cooper, whose stories I absolutely adore. Very different to my work, but just tender, exquisite portraits of everyday Black people in the most wonderful, humane way. I remember reading that collection and weeping, actually. or the first time I read that. So just to feel seen, even though it was a Black American context. So for me, it's really important, but also when I was reading stuff that, was published in the UK, there is the pressure to tell certain narratives. And, we often aren't allowed the freedom of our white counterparts to really play and experiment, or even, be given permission to do that. And as somebody that's always been quite alternative in the way that I think and what I consume, my stuff was always going to be slightly left field. And once I gave myself permission to do that, from reading women that I love, like, I don't know, Octavia Butler, who's extraordinary, Margaret Atwood, who I absolutely love, Ursula Le Guin as well, these visionary women artists who just found a way really to create space for themselves. That gave me a lot of courage to tell stories about Blackness, but in ways that felt hopefully interesting and expansive, and really show that, Blackness is not a monolith. We're not monolithic. There's a wealth of different experiences, and I wanted to be able to show that, but sort of couched within these almost unexpected stories. I think I remember when my agent was first submitting my stories to publishers here, and the feedback we got was that we don't really know what to do with her. We don't know how we're going to market her. We like it, but sorry. It was just like this confusion. But it was interesting to me because, they wouldn't have that issue with, I don't know, my white female counterpart, so getting around that was kind of difficult, but I had decided that it was so important to keep telling these stories and to keep claiming space, because, somewhere down the line, hopefully, I don't know, some young Black girl or some young person of color or whoever will pick up the stories and get something from it. Similar to the first time I picked up Jazz by Toni Morrison, and I was just absolutely blown away by what she was doing with language. I mean, she wrote a book that mimicked a musical genre. I mean, who does that? It was just the confidence and the quality and the multiplicity of the references within the writing, the richness. It just blew my mind. And I thought, wow, this is somebody who's actually quite experimental with language, but that doesn't really get talked about much with her. A lot of it is social commentary about Blackness and kind of the history, which is also equally important. But I think it's important to remember that she was an experimental Black writer. She was amazing in terms of what she did with form and all the different books, and the different voices, and just I guess the sort of limitless possibilities of her work, and how they encourage people like myself, can't be underestimated. So for me, like, Blackness and centering it in ways that are interesting is key. It's like a core component of what I do, but also writing about, Black women and complicated Black women, really messy Black women, because often we have a pressure to be, behave well, I think, or to be seen as behaving well. Whereas, no one's perfect. We're all human, and it's to show that. It's really important for me to show that complexity, and sexuality as well. All of that is really, I think, key in the writing.
I wanted to pick up on one name you just mentioned, Octavia Butler. And I mean, I was introduced to your work, in a late, like 4 a.m. conversation with Victoria Sin. And we were talking, she's a really great performance artist, really, but she's, really into language and how language forms our consciousness and our social kind of action. And so we were kind of really geeking out on science fiction. And so we were just sharing like what was recent stuff we had read, and we were talking about, Cixin Liu and Chinese fiction, or Ted Chiang, and then your name popped up, and obviously I didn't know it at that point, and so she was very laudatory, and quickly ordered the book, and here we are today. But I wanted to ask, your work is very, instead of gender bending like Victoria, it's genre bending. I mean, in the same way it is too, but it's very genre bending. I mean, does it feel weird to put you in a lineage with like Octavia Butler or Samuel R. Delany and look at you as science fiction? We've mentioned the time traveling monks, or there's kind of, the cloned child boy. There's definitely the science fiction there, but at the same time, there's, the magic realism or just maybe oral tradition of storytelling or media. Like, it's all over the place. But is it fair to put you in that lineage of science fiction, or is that a little too pigeonholing even for you?
Well, I mean, it's a compliment to be mentioned, with Octavia Butler and Samuel L. Delany. There are definitely, I would say, pieces that I guess people could say that fits into the science fiction genre, but it is really, really varied. It's a real mix, I think, in terms of like genre. Like you said, it's surreal. There's there's the fantastical. Some people would say, it's fabulous is another term that people often use to describe it. So it's a real mix. I mean, it's not that I've intentionally done that. It's just the way the stories have turned out. And then when I look back on it and read, it's like, oh my goodness, okay, this has this element and this has sci-fi elements and this and this sits in between, I don't know, sci-fi and fable, or I don't even know what this is, but I find that really fascinating. Really interesting writing can sit in between genres in that you don't quite know how to like pigeon, like frame it in a way. So it kind of leaves room for interpretation. It feels, I think often with my stories, they feel familiar, but also new. So, even with Nudibranch, it's set on this, fictional island. And it's about this mysterious woman from the sea who is able to shed her skin and is looking for love, really. And we all recognize that. It's almost like modern internet dating, where she's, moving from one man to another to try to find the one. But there's a really dark element to her, her aspect of seeking the one. That, I mean, I think it's quite, darkly humorous too. I think that there's also there's also lots of humor in the writing, and in that particular piece, it's like dark, but it's funny, and we, certainly, like I said, you recognize that element of trying to connect with people and the loneliness, of being human sometimes, and what that can look like and what that can feel like. I mean that's recognizable, but maybe the place isn't. So it's that thing of combining what feels familiar but what feels new as well. Well, hopefully, what elements that feel new too.
We've invited you into this studio art curatorial program, but we've actually really cracked open the dissertation or the thesis writing, and to include fiction, and to really look at poetry, to look at short story or experimental writing. We've had everything from novels to like a whole story written via Twitter communication. And so it's been kind of all over the place. Some more successful than others, but it's great to see the students really experimenting and looking at language in the written form as part of their creative practice. And we're trying to figure that out as instructors here, as students, as a program in general, what it means in the academy, what it means to relate language to a studio or plastic practice, to a curatorial aspect of thinking. And so I wanted to kind of go into that. And actually, I saw a question pop up from our next speaker, Lauren Fournier, who's speaking on auto theory fiction and feminist practice kind of in just a couple of weeks. So I'll just read her question because I think it actually really folds in. And that reminds me, please, people throw your questions into the ring, and we'd love to hear from you. And I'll just kind of read Lauren's question now, which is quite fitting. I would be curious if Erenison wants to speak more to that experience of not fitting into the genre category, and how/where she sees her practice in writing short fiction fitting into that. So is there something about short fiction as a form that allowed you to feel that space, capacity, containment within which to experiment?
Yeah, great question. And yeah, I would say 100%. It's interesting that my first book was a novel, and I'd written the first draft, and I was kind of frustrated with it. So but I didn't want to stop writing. And I remember I'd had Dennis Johnson's collection, Jesus' Son, for 7 years. I mean, it's still my favorite collection ever. I just think it's absolutely tremendous. And I'd had that on my shelf for 7 years. I'd never picked it up, never read it. And during this time where I was just like, I've had enough of the novel, I need a break, I picked up that collection. It was the first collection I picked up, and it absolutely blew my mind. It's a small collection. And those of you who I'm sure some people might have read it, but it's a small collection. But it's so freewheeling, and it's surreal, but it was incredibly humane, because it was looking at this character who is a drug addict and is on the fringes of society, and you're not really supposed to care that much about him as an audience. But what Johnson did so beautifully is bring you into his world, and it's these series of interconnected stories, and it just had a massive impact on me in terms of, I had no idea that short fiction could do that. I thought only novels could make you feel that way, could make you have that level of investment, so it was really a surprise to me. And what it did was it opened up like a door in my brain. Like, this feels different, this feels different than working on a novel. Like, I want to play with this, so I started writing my own short stories. And I started reading more short stories as well. I also read ZZ Packer's collection, Drinking Coffee Elsewhere, fantastic collection too, which is about, Black women and Black girls in America. And it was just beautifully done, really funny and really sharply observed. So I started feeding myself different collections, and I started playing with the form. And what was cool was that, I realized that you can do different things. You can write a short story as a series of like almost postcard-like vignettes. You can write a short story as a rant, which I have done. One of the pieces in Speak Gigantular, my first collection, is really just this massive rant from a mother's perspective, lamenting the choices of her son who's mentally unraveling. So, doing things like that where you can just play. I felt like the short form gave me permission to do that. And I credit the short form for allowing me to discover my experimental voice. Because with the novel, it's set in 3 different time periods, and it was very ambitious for a first novel. And second person, like third person, first person. So I was doing different things, but I think it wasn't until I'd started writing short stories that I really felt like I had, I got a sense of who I am as a writer, or who I wanted to be as a writer. I felt like short fiction did that for me. And then when I'd written the first collection, after I finished it, when I went back to the novel, up more confident, because in some ways, again, with the short form, you're doing more with less. You're creating these different you're creating miniature worlds essentially, and holding someone's interest, hopefully throughout the whole thing. And I don't, that's not easy to do, but I think just the sheer joy of what you can do with the short form kind of gave me the confidence to keep writing. And I ignored a lot of the things that I heard and read, which was, don't write short stories. No one cares about short stories.
No one respects it.
No one respects short stories. I just ignored all of that because I love them so much. So I think the form, I have so much love for the form and what it's done. And there are so many exciting writers out there. I remember reading, just in terms of having permission to write my collection. I remember reading Miranda July's collection, for the first time, and it was so strange and funny. And Miranda fascinated me as well because she's a filmmaker too, and I love film, and some of her pieces were quite filmic too. And I thought it was really interesting the way she straddled those 2 mediums so brilliantly, that they kind of fed into each other, and you could see that in her writing. So all of that just encouraged me, I think, to want to kind of pursue that form.
It's a strange bias, it's the feature film versus the short film, or it's the novel versus the short story. And I mean, the short story is, I've argued, always the best. It's the perfect form of narrative. My first degree in English was on Kafka, who never published a novel in his lifetime. It was just like all these short stories and fragments and the aphorism. And when Alice Munro, you mentioned Margaret Atwood, but Alice Munro, right, with the Booker Prize, finally it was like, oh, someone's getting, the short story is getting respect finally.
Yeah.
Someone who taught this as a career genre to really go into these worlds and explore and move through, that it's shifting. So I think writers like you would break out with the novel and then are following up with these collections of short stories as mature forms of storytelling and a way is really exciting. And it's definitely a book. It's a book. I mean, the language is interweaved, like I said, whether it's the tongue that surfaces through multiple forms throughout it or other kind of aspects of fossils. I mean, there's definitely leitmotifs going through. It's not a fragmented, collection of previously published whatever and just throw it together to make some money. It's a definitely calculated collection of writing in itself. So, congratulations for that.
Thank you.
Lauren, thanks so much for that question. It's really great to kind of have the whole point of these series is to have different speakers kind of engaging with each other. And I wanted to ask, what you're working on next, partly because I know one of the questions or like one of the things we had in a conversation before this was talking about another one of our speakers, Angela Schubert, the German choreographer, who was working with our graduate students in the fall to do an intimate kind of choreography and body workshop and plant consciousness. And he works through these kind of plant consciousness. And we just had Philippa Ramos just before you talk about the virus and the post-human. And so you would mention something that you're working towards, something along these lines. So we, from Nudibranch into more of this. Do you want to tell us a little bit what you're working on now?
Yeah, so I'm working on a novel at the moment, which is set. It's like learning to walk all over again because you leave one form for a bit, having written 2 collections, So now I'm writing a new novel, which I'm excited about. Hopefully it will be expansive. But it's looking at 2 different dimensions, which I like to do and play around with. And I think there's a lot around like consciousness and traveling between consciousness in the novel and transformation without giving away the plot, which I'm always sort of fascinated by. So those are definitely key themes within it. And hopefully it's going to be an expansive, interesting book. And I'm sure people who've read my other books will see the connection in some way, I hope, like a thread. But it will be my 4th book. So I'm excited about it, but it's kind of, I'm at first draft stage where, you're still sort of building that skeleton, which you'll come back to again. Whereas it's such a different experience to writing a short story, because for me, like the process of writing a short story is so feverish and, this kind of palpable excitement. And I think you feel that on the page with my pieces. You can feel like that kind of momentum. Whereas with the novel, it's much more measured, I think, so it's definitely almost like using 2 different sides of the brain. For me, it's like 2 different practices. So I probably will write a short story or 2 in between working on the novel, just to get like my fix, because like I'm a bit of an addict. So, to get that kind of injection of energy. But it's definitely interesting being back in the novel space, because it's that thing of, similar to when I was working on my first novel, you get halfway and suddenly you panic because you're just like, oh my God, how am I going to tie all these threads together? Where am I going with it? How do I keep the momentum? It's the danger zone for me, like that middle part. So I'm just there at the moment, and it's kind of difficult being in lockdown when you're in that middle part, because you need so many different things to feed you and keep that momentum going. But hopefully I'll be able to produce something good. But it's it's nice to be working on something.
While we just wait for maybe another question to kind of filter in, you're usually, I'm assuming, talking to aspiring writers, talking maybe in more literary scenes. So kind of continue with that, the experimental, the kind of ravenous energy that comes with a short story. Well, do you have any advice to young writers? Like this is our graduate proseminar. So if some of them are taking on a more experimental aspect of writing, work through conceptual ideas, to work through politics, to work through questions of identity, to work through questions of reality. What would your, I guess, tips be? What would your suggestions be for artists that are trying to branch out into this type of expression as a parallel practice to their studio? I mean, do you have any advice?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that lean into it, definitely, if it's something that you're keen to do, because it informs other aspects of your art as well as your identity. And there's something really, I think, enriching about feeling like you're adding to the conversation, you're stretching it. It's not just the same, and that for me is really exciting. So yeah, I would definitely encourage your students to do that and to play. Like, I see writing as a space of play. And when I came to it with that intention, I felt so liberated. It almost takes the pressure off. Like, it doesn't have to be this perfect thing. It just has to be something that you really enjoy, interrogating a theme or an idea or a feeling that you kind of want to mine through and process, or work through. And the writing space is great for that. I would also say, absorb as much interesting arts as possible. Give yourself permission by reading the works of other artists who have done things that are really interesting, who have pushed the boundaries, whether that's in film, theatre, poetry, visual arts, whatever the medium is. Like, look and seek those voices that have really taken that kind of leap of faith, because what that does is it makes you feel much more confident to go into that space. I mentioned people like Octavia Butler, who did that, and one of the early influences, I think, was a Polish director who made this series of short films called Decalogue. And I at the time, this was years ago, I didn't really know much about Polish film or anything, but I had picked it up, and it was like a series of short stories. And what he did with those series of films is just tremendous. Kind of exploring the Polish experience from different levels in terms of class and social mobility, and like profound themes like the meaning of life and death, and how all of that has an impact on us. And I thought to myself at the time, God, I would love to write a short story collection that does something similar, but is just weirder, and more experimental. But there was something in the element that he created that really stayed with me. And similarly, there's a film he did called The Double Life of Veronique, which I just absolutely adore. And it's about doppelgangers, and having somebody who looks just like you living a whole nother life, and feeling that sense of it somehow in the ether, that sense of magic. So it's about parallel lives and all of this stuff that I just thought was quite magical and really, really exciting. So all of that fed into like what I was doing and what I was trying to create, just taking aspects from different people and being inspired by it. But also, my identity as a Nigerian British woman, that thing of you are more than one thing, and how that's always evolving. So like, look to your own history as well. Look to ways that you can mine that, and you can interpret that in really dynamic, exciting ways. So yeah, I definitely think, and also, if possible, find somebody who's generous, who can be a mentor like figure that can also give you permission in a way, or just be somebody who listens and feeds back on what you do and says, I really like that chapter that you wrote, or change that element, it's not working. But being in a space where you feel seen, makes a world of difference. So if you can pair off with other students, as a student, form sort of partnerships where you can support each other, or spaces where people can produce work and feel like there's some sort of organic galvanizing that happens. I think all of that is really important. I know that I was actively seeking that as well when I was writing. I was never somebody that wrote and hid away. I was always kind of looking to connect with people, going to spoken word nights, poetry nights, going to exhibitions, going to watch other authors that I admired read, and asking them, like, accosting them afterwards, and asking them to have coffee, and, just finding ways to be connected, I think. So do all of that, but most importantly, be excited. I think that really helps drive, whatever you want to do.
There's one thing in there that really also kind of stood out a little bit uniquely, I think, in this intersection. A lot of the times, I think, at least in the contemporary moment, at least particularly in Toronto, with artists making work, it's often very biographical because it's speaking about politics. It's often very much about who's speaking and whose body is speaking, or whose land, and these questions, which are very rooted in a materiality. And the questions of essentialism bubbling up again is a difficult thing to be processing. And reconciling, a politics with an imagination at certain times. And sometimes it feels a little bit restraining. And with your work, it's explosive, as you just said. So, a person is so many things. And in your, collection, I think it's from Mozambique to Martinique to Berlin to Japan, all across time zones. It's mothers, it's clones, it's tongues, it's goddesses. Like you take on almost every possible identity that one can imagine. And I was wondering how that fits in, or how liberating that is to talk about these questions versus the autobiographical moment, and speaking just from that autobiographical moment, which is very powerful. And of course, it's important, but sometimes I feel the art world is a little bit maps that on and projects that on as an expectation to people. Right. And as a fiction writer, it's almost built into creating multiple characters. Like you kind of almost have to do that to weave a narrative. And so I was wondering, how that is for you as you talk about the things you're thinking about. And it's such a global collection of identities that you're writing about, and how that fits in amorphous kind of beings that you enter into.
Yeah, no, great question. Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely think, obviously, that identity feeds into it, and there are stories that explore that. But yeah, the beauty of being a writer, like you said, is it's almost like being God, where you get to experience different existences and what that feels like. And it's like, living in somebody else's skin. What's it like to be a monk? In a space where they're kind of killing off each other. What's it like to be, a man who's struggling with the death of his mother, and he goes back to Mozambique to reconcile with loss, and the decision to have left his homeland, and what that means for an albino man whose very existence is dangerous, going back to where he's from. So that thing of being an other within an other. Was interesting to explore in that story. And then, in another story, Point and Trill, it's a couple who the relationship is disintegrating, but it's about desire, and it's about a woman succumbing to desire. It's a very central, dark story, because the woman in it is feeling a change happening in her, and she doesn't want to hold back from these changes, and her partner is almost not recognizing who he's with anymore. And so it's that thing of, you never fully really know each other in a relationship. But that's a white couple, and it's set in Wales. So I definitely have a view where I'm interested in all kinds of stories. I'm definitely very interested in centering Blackness and writing about people of color, but I think that's the beauty about being a writer, is that you can, there are entry points, because we're all human, and we have connections, things that unify us. And yes, there are things that are specific to a particular experience. But even when you tell those specific stories, there are things that connect people, So, in reading a story about, I don't know, a young Black woman who's trying to get a sense of herself in London, somebody in, I don't know, Canada, a young white woman in Canada might go, oh my God, I recognize what it's like to kind of be all at sea. Like, I might not understand the pain of what she goes through, of being kind of invisible, and, the structural elements that she faces, but there are things that I will recognize. And, so it's about being fearless in that way. and, you know, not being restricted in terms of telling the story, as long as you, I think, do the characters justice, and, you know, you give them dimension and thought and care and nuance, you know, so it's from a place of respect. You know, you're coming to the page to show or depict these different characters. But, you know, I'm also interested in different, you know, worldviews, you know, so I'm interested in Africa. I'm from Nigeria, I'm from Africa, but, you know, I don't know Africa enough. And, you know, so it's always interesting for me to write about it, and maybe write about it, not necessarily always about Nigeria, you know. So, for example, I wrote about Cape Verde, in my first collection, Speak Gigantular, which is that was kind of an autobiographical story, I have to say, because a lot of it was from my sister and I going on holiday to Cape Verde, and feeling other in that place. You know, what's it like to be Black and be Africa and be in a part of Africa where you are the outsider, and, you know, you feel kind of very foreign and all at sea. So it was a fascinating experience. I loved it, you know, so interesting. So to be able to show different parts and different sides of Africa, you know, in Cabo Verde, you know, they surf all the time, and, you know, people don't think about Black people surfing, but they do that there as like a regular thing. It's normal, you know. So it was just fascinating to me. So to be able to show these different things is really exciting. And like you say, to be able to just like enter these different worlds and find rich ways of exploring them and interrogating them. That's what we live for as writers, you know, and we don't want to be restricted in doing that. So for me, it's like being a kid in a sweet shop, you know. It's you know, what excites me, and what story do I want to tell, and from whose perspective, you know, and who gets to have agency and who doesn't, you know. So all of these, and of course the political, you know, art is political, so, you know, there's always an element of that in it, I think, as well.
Perfect. Well, I think we're like approaching our hour for conversation. So if there's not another question, we can wrap it up. I'm not sure if you wanted to read a little bit more, or if we should just leave it there. I also know you're in a significantly more advanced time zone than we are. So speaking of time travel and stuff, so I'll maybe leave it with you. How would you like to wrap this up? With just a sweet goodbye, or do you have something that was read? I can't remember if we were going to do that or not.
Yeah, I have a short excerpt from Nudibranch itself, so we can end on that.
I would love that. Yeah, that'd be amazing.
Yeah. Okay, so Nudibranch, as I mentioned, this is the title story, and in this piece, a very mysterious, sensual woman of the sea arrives on this island of eunuchs in search of love, and chaos ensues. So this is a short excerpt from Nudibranch. After the burning ceremony, she picks up Matthew, a scientist from a makeshift bar on the beach. Light of the huts cast a warm glow on their skin. The soft-bodied women pair off with men who are still high from their ritual. There is alcohol flowing, a social lubricant that makes any gathering less awkward. Kiru assesses these women clinically, knowing their flaws will rise to the surface of clean water before breaking through. She listens for it. Matthew is talkative, eager. They laugh, carrying their drinks to the back end of the beach, deep into the belly of trees and land that feels joyously remote. There is the occasional rare white orchid, and empty alcohol bottles contain formations of past nights. Music from a stage at the far end of the beach filters through. Gulping rum, they are joined by iguanas eating sap from the pale trees that makes them daze, and one-eyed water crickets from a tale man forgot to include in the Bible. I'm so happy I burned the clothes I arrived in, Matthew flicks a petal from his Hawaiian pattern shorts. Oh yes, it's liberating, as if a shackle's been broken. There is something in the air here. I feel like another version of myself, and the women, fuck, we can do anything here. You are like Einstein, Kiru offers, pulling him closer, like his equation of general relativity, mutating in the fabric of space and time. Yes, he says, a look of wonder in his eyes at her, the surroundings, the possibilities. He knocks back his drink. Matthew considers himself a eunuch because of his impotency. She tells him about the shape and girth of an invisible penis he will gain by the time the night is over. Do you know what betrayal tastes like? She asks. There is a burden to carrying salty alphabets on my tongue. Matthew blinks up at her, heady, tipsy, a little confused. 3 hours pass. Kiru becomes annoyed. She cannot imagine Matthew reaching for the sound of bones tumbling in water, succumbing to being realigned in the frothing white, stark against it, brightly lit, and carrying mouthfuls of seaweed with stories of their own to tell. She realizes she cannot love him. His receding hairline elicits sympathy, not attraction. His snaggle-toothed, breathy revelations about science had begun to grate. He would yammer on endlessly until she strangled him on the shoreline. Catching him unaware, she sticks her fingers into his chest, melting flesh, the charred scent rising up to their nostrils as a pattern of smoke unwinds from his chest, shaped like small nudibranch. She reaches through bone, a blueprint at birth washed away by the pumping of blood. Her fingers reach further in, finding his misshapen heart. She runs a finger over the muscle, over the pumping rhythm she has already caught with the damp folds of her vagina. He is hypnotized by the gleam in her eyes, the baring of her teeth, the lightning blue lines of light running beneath her skin as though she is a circuit. Her fingers grab his heart, pulling it right out. A sucking sound ensues, followed by a vacuum. He makes an ah noise. It is surprise. It is relief. It is tender. A carrier pigeon hovers above, shedding a feather that tumbles into the vacuum in his chest, skimming the last conversation he had with an air stewardess once on an EasyJet flight about the weight of atoms. The feather tumbling in the dark will change color once it hits the bottom. The carrier pigeon will report this to others in its flock. Kiru finds a quiet spot to eat his heart beneath a tree oozing sap, enjoying the shelter under its drooping white palm-like leaves. She is ravenous. His heart tastes of cigarettes, red wine, tiny bits of aluminium, of small murmurs machines hadn't detected yet. She polishes it off in 4 bites, licking her fingers clean. Then she stands beneath the ghostly tree, holding her arms up to the light. She sheds her skin. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. That's a great expert. I'm just going to put in the chat. I know this is your publisher. I know you're looking for a North American publisher distribution deal. So I know that's why it's great to kind of get you exposed here and have this conversation here in virtual North America.
Yes, it's wonderful. Thank you.
So I put a link in there for people because I think you're really fresh and new for a lot of the students. So I think that's probably why they're a little bit quiet and this is their first exposure to you. So you can get, I know you can get, take a while to get a hardcover or something like that, which is a beautiful edition. Or you can get some digital books if you wanted a little bit quicker there. So again, thanks for joining us this evening and taking the time to read and share with us your experience. I'm just going to put another link in there for the next event, which is for Lauren's talk with Pamela. And again, thank you so much, Renee, for doing everything behind the scenes. We've recorded the talk, so we'll make sure that's up there if some of our colleagues couldn't make it tonight or they're a little Zoom fatigued, as Erenison and I have talked about as we set up for this, then of course there's a great thing to listen to later on, and we'll post everything on the channel as always. We've also put up Philippa, so for people who missed Philippa Ramos's talk, that's already online on the Daniel's YouTube channel under the MVS Proseminar playlist, along with Chris Lee and a few other guests this week. So again, Erenison, thank you so much, and we'll see everyone in a couple of weeks.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a joy, and hope to see you guys again.
Definitely. Bye.